everyone. Thanks so much for staying for my talk. I'm Sarah Joy, and I'm here to talk about poetic devices, what they are, some examples of them, and how on earth they relate to programming. So a little bit about myself first. I'm a web developer, a wannabe indie maker, and a poet. I wear many hats, but I think the most exciting hat I wear is this weird conglomeration of what I studied in college, which was creative writing, and what I studied after college, which was web development. I make a variety of things like browser extensions, what I call HTML and CSS illustrations like the piano, and interactive poetry like what you see on your right, which is a poem called Chore Wheel. I also have written poetry with code, which I'll get back to in a second. So there are two main things I want y'all to take away from this talk. Some new poetry vocabulary words that you may not have known before, so you can impress your friends. And I'm also going to talk about how I think those vocabulary words and poetic devices are used or can be used in code. And I hope that your newfound knowledge about poetry and the similarities between poetry and code will inspire you to try your hand at writing some poetry with your favorite programming language. So earlier this year, I was super excited to publish this poem I wrote in JavaScript. It was published in Stripe's magazine called Increment for their issue on programming languages. So you have to have some technical knowledge of JavaScript to understand this poem. There's a technical aspect to it. You have to be familiar with like functions, set timeout, add event listener, as well as concepts like null, this, and even just the idea of functions. But we're here to talk about the poetic aspect to this. What makes this a poem? So there are some poetic devices at work here, a couple of which I'm going to touch on. So I want to talk about 5 different poetic devices that I think are interesting, useful, and even present in the code you are already writing. But first, let's define what a poetic device is. It is a technique used by poets to shape or form their poem, and it's used to create rhythm or enhance or explore meaning or a concept, or to intensify a mood, a feeling, or an atmosphere. You're probably already familiar with some poetic devices like rhyming patterns, similes, and metaphors. So the 5 poetic devices I want to talk about are conceit, dropped line, anaphora, epiphora, and antecedent. So starting with conceit. So conceit is an extended metaphor, which means that it often goes for like the entire poem or multiple stanzas, not just like 1 or 2 lines. And it often compares 2 things you wouldn't think to pair together. So this is an excerpt from Adrienne Rich's poem, Diving into the Wreck. And it's a pretty lengthy poem describing a scuba diver's experience of exploring a shipwreck. And it's never explicitly stated, but one reading of this poem is that Rich is comparing a divorce with a shipwreck. And I think the lines, I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail, really supports that idea and shows the speaker reflecting on both the positive and negative outcomes from divorce or a shipwreck. In code, I would argue that we're almost always working with some kind of conceit or extended metaphor, especially when we're working with objects. Since the objects in our code are often representative of real-world ideas or things, they're already kind of a metaphor. We're comparing like this real-life thing with the idea of an object, for example. And since we get to define what properties and methods that object has, we can explore an extended metaphor in a really unique way. So next up is dropped line. A dropped line is when one line of a poem is split into 2, and the second line is indented to match its original alignment. So in this example, a snippet of Black Zodiac by a poet named Charles Wright, we see 2 dropped lines, one at the beginning of the stanza and one at the bottom of the screen, which is really the middle of the stanza. There's more to this stanza with a couple more dropped lines. In poetry, dropped lines can be used to emphasize certain phrases as well as to give the visual aspect of the poem more movement. So the next line the next dropped line in this stanza actually has the same ending as the last one you see here. You've got to write it down. The repetition of this, as well as the repetition of the dropped line spacing, really emphasizes that phrase. We do this and variations of this so often when writing code. While in code, it's usually used to make our code more readable, it can still be a useful technique for drawing attention to phrases or adding visual interest to a block of text. One example of where we might see a dropped line in our code is when we chain multiple array methods. So these next two are related. They're both forms of repetition. I know one major goal when writing code is to keep things like dry and not repetitive, but in contrast, poetry often uses repetition to create rhythm and to emphasize ideas. So in this area, I would say it's totally okay to use your poetic license and repeat code if you'd like. The first type of repetition is called anaphora. It's the repetition of the beginning of a phrase or sentence. The repetition of what part of, in this excerpt of Stephanie Gray's poem, creates an atmosphere of questioning. And it also creates a familiar rhythm in each line that provides a sense of comfort, so readers don't spiral too much while they're exploring these questions and ideas. In code, we would see anaphora maybe when we're calling the same function with different parameters, or when we're defining multiple variables. It has a similar effect of adding a sense of rhythm to what we've written. Anaphora is the repetition of a word or phrase at the end of a line. So here we have the phrase, "then there is now," repeated at the end of each line of this excerpt from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. The repetition makes us confront the idea of the present over and over and over again, and since that's at the end of the line, it's the last thing we're thinking about, giving it a little bit more weight. In our code, we might see this when repeating again a method call, the same method, either with the same parameters or maybe without any parameters at all, but being called on different objects. And again, I am suggesting like the use of repetition in a poem written in code is definitely requires some poetic license because it's not going to be very clean. Finally, the last poetic device I wanted to touch on is the antecedent, which some of you might remember from English class. It's arguably more of like a literary or grammatical term, but I wanted to talk about it because it relates to, I think, a very beloved part of JavaScript specifically. So an antecedent is an earlier word that a pronoun or another word refers back to. So in poetry, it and its pronouns are used to reduce repetition of a word and ideally make connections and ideas in the poem clear. In this example, from To Autumn by John Keats, the bees is the antecedent of the pronouns in the next two lines, they and their. In code, the first thing that jumped out to me as an example of antecedent is everyone's favorite part of JavaScript, this, which essentially acts like a pronoun for another object in our code. So next time you're trying to figure out what this is referring to, you can ask, what is its antecedent? Another interesting part of this, I think, is that in code, ambiguity is kind of seen as a bad thing. We don't want to be confused about what this represents, but if you're writing a poem, that ambiguity can be a really useful and interesting tool to play with. So those were the 5 poetic devices I wanted to share with y'all. Conceit, dropped line, anaphora, anaphora, and antecedent. Taking another look at my poem, we can see that I used a couple of those poetic devices, especially anaphora with the repetition of you and this dot, etc. And antecedent, again, with you being the antecedent for this. There are dozens more poetic devices we could talk about, but to wrap up, I wanted to share some programming concepts and ideas that I think would be really fun to explore and play with in a poem. So many reserved words and functions in programming languages, I think, lend themselves to being pretty expressive, like promises, or if-else statements, or while loops. or like requests and responses. So I hope you're all feeling a little inspired by the possibility of writing some code poetry. These are a couple more resources if you're interested in more code poetry. If Hemingway Wrote JavaScript is a really cool book, and it explores writing code through a literary lens even more. It imagines how different writers would write JavaScript. And then Source Code Poetry is an annual contest for poetry written with code. They have prizes every year, and this year the writer of If Hemingway Wrote JavaScript was actually a judge. These are the websites and resources I used for this talk. And then these are the icons from the nounproject.com. And finally, here are a link to my slides. Thanks.